Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This was back in 2015, where I was 16 years old. I'm male, by the way. This was in the summer, where both my parents went to visit some of our relatives out of town, and they would not be home for 3 days. I was the only child, and I was the only one left in the house. My grandma did visit me every single day to make me lunch. They did not ask that of her since I did know how to cook, but who can stop her, right? But of course, she didn't stay during the nights. And that's when I went wild, watching movies, gaming, watching YouTube, everything you could picture a 16-year-old doing when his parents aren't home. So the second night I was watching a movie and I ran out of chips. I paused the movie and I went down in the kitchen to grab some more. But that's when I hear a window break and a door opening. The kitchen was separate from where the living room was, where the door has been opened. I grab a knife and I slowly peek my head around. And there he was, a tall man around 2 meters, 6 feet, and had a baseball cap, some old jacket, probably leather, and it was torn on the right sleeve. My phone was in the room upstairs. From the kitchen door, the stairs were directly to its right, so in my dumb mind, I was thinking that I could sneak past him and then lock myself in. He was going through the shelf next to the door, very loudly I must say, and so I got to the stairs somehow. And then he turns around and then realizes that I was there. Out of fear, I guess, I screamed and I threw the knife at him. I missed him, but it hit the wall beside his head, sticking the knife in there. I guess he got scared by me, my savage screaming, and the throw, so he ran out before I could grab another knife. And yes, I did run back to get another. Adrenaline is one hell of a drug. When I saw him left, I ran to my room and then I called the cops. They came quickly and just took fingerprints and any DNA samples that they could find. The next morning, I called my parents and they came back around the noon. I don't know why, but I kept the knife lodged into the wall next to the door. So the first question asked is, why was there a knife in the wall? My family then changed the front door with a more heavy-duty one, and they arrested the guy within the same week. One of the cops told me that the guy was thinking that I was going to kill him and try to call the police on an attempted murder. So I guess the moral of the story is hide when someone is robbing your house, or learn how to act like a maniac. First, we will need context. My old house was pretty pumped up on security. We had a finger ID, passcodes on doors, and cameras everywhere, and an automatic security system that could either call the police or play a fake "the cops have been called blah blah blah" kind of audio. And this story happened a few years back. My dad noticed a weird-looking man, pretty covered up, lurking on the street just outside our house. We thought nothing of it since sometimes you get the occasional drunk or high person just wandering around. But this man started to inch closer to our house, first being on the opposite side of our street, and before we knew it, he was basically on our property. We just sort of watched him to see what he would do, and I'm pretty sure that we got bored and walked away and just forgot about it. But then, we started to hear strange noises coming from downstairs, where our front door was. So, we decided to switch on the camera, and sure enough, this guy is banging on our door, trying to get in, Then he looks through a window. He then gives up and then starts to go around the side. There was a set of stairs that lead to the upper area where we were. He then starts to head up the stairs, which then sent my dad to go to the other side of the house with a knife and then scream at him. This guy runs down and we don't see him again. Well, that's the end of the story, right? Wrong. This guy comes back again, and I guess he saw that the car was gone from the driveway. My dad had gone to get something, leaving me and my mom at home. And then he looks around. We didn't want to confront this guy, so I had the idea of playing the fake cop alert that could be heard outside. So we played it, and as soon as the guy heard it, he ran. We never saw him again, and never want to. What makes this story creepier is that on the news later, it showed a guy who lurked around houses and killed people had been arrested. And when we looked, it was the same man who was at our house. Usually on nice days, I'm at the park, and during my time there, I smoke. After parking under the tree next to a blue SUV, I start getting high. There are other people at the park, but just us two were parked together with 3 spaces in between. I look over to my left, and there's this old guy leaning into my car window asking me questions. I'm nervous as hell, so I pick up my phone and then start scrolling on Facebook. He then proceeded to ask me my name, and I said Lily. He then asked where I lived, and I pointed in some random ass direction. He then tells me how he wanted to cook and that he lives in his $50,000 SUV. And to be honest, I didn't care. So I'm still looking at my phone and I put out the blunt. And he is now telling me that he is 50, which to be honest, he looked like he was 70. And he loved how beautiful my skin was. Now, I'm freaking the hell out. I'm high, so I'm nervous and irritated, but I also didn't want to be rude. So I just said, "Oh, thank you." He then said if I wanted to smoke with I could, since he's always at that park. I told him that I had a girlfriend and that I am not interested, and he says, "Well, I guess I'm holding you up." And I replied, "Yes." I start putting on my seatbelt and I turn my car on. And still leaning in my window, he says, "I love you." And I just say, okay. He starts walking back to his car, laughing as I'm rolling my shits up. He leaves before me, and I follow him to the intersection. And I did that because I wanted to get his license plate and to see which way he was going. Now I'm paranoid and just driving around because I didn't want to potentially lead him to my house. And when I felt comfortable, I knew he wasn't around. I booked it home and I haven't left since. I know I could have left sooner, but this was my first ever encounter like that at this park. So if you have any good advice for the next time, please let me know. A long time ago, way back when I was young, probably around 9 or 10, I would spend pretty much my entire summer vacation at my grandmother's house, which was lakeside property. The edge of her backyard actually lined up with one of the larger lakes in our area, and it was a really neat place to stay for the summer. I'm pretty sure that my parents did it just to get rid of me for a couple of months, and also to keep my grandmother happy. But I loved it. It didn't feel like I was being exiled from my own home at all. Even better one year, my aunt and uncle had to move in with my grandmother while they were looking for a new place. which meant that I got to enjoy the summer with all 3 of my cousins. Back when I was that age, my cousin Pete was actually one of my best friends. When he and I would get together, we would be inseparable. He was older than me by only 4 months, so it was almost like we were twin brothers. Always doing the same thing, we enjoyed the same things, and we acted pretty much the same. That is to say, that we were both a bit rowdy and considered the troublemakers. Well, anyways, on to the story. This took place back when I was about 10, going on 11. I was, like I said, a bit of a troublemaker. I was a smart kid, but I also had a bit of a mouth on me, in that I would talk back and make witty quips or remarks to adults that would typically land me in trouble. I guess you could say that I was a bit rude, honestly. The only person that could really put me in my place was my grandmother. She knew the exact tone that would make me behave, and she had a way to make me shut my mouth and be good, typically involving an old fishing rod that belonged to my late grandfather. My cousin Pete wasn't fazed by it whatsoever. He would take the lashing and he would talk back to her, and he was mean to her, which is probably the only thing that I had a major problem with when it came to him. I loved my grandma, and he treated her like garbage. This specific year is, as stated, the year that my aunt and uncle, and also my cousins, had to temporarily move into the lake house. My aunt and uncle still worked, so they weren't home most of the time. My oldest cousin was 17, so he'd landed a job at a grocery store. And my middle cousin, Shannon, wanted nothing to do with us, so it was mostly just Pete and I. On the day in question, we were inside the lake house and I think we were playing the old Nintendo, when my grandmother asked us to help her with some housework. I stood up and I went to leave, and Pete angrily asked me where I was going. I told him that I was going to help Grandma and then asked if he was coming. He sneered at me and said that he didn't want to help the old bat, but he said much harsher words that I'm willing to ever put in the same sentence as my beloved grandmother. I told him that I didn't care if he did help, but I was going to help her. He reluctantly threw the controller down and then said fine, following behind me. We both went to see what we were needed for, and my grandmother asked us to start a load of laundry for her while she made us lunch, and then told us that my aunt and uncle would be home soon, so we needed to hurry. We left the room and went to start the laundry. I turned on the washer and started loading in the clothing that was in the basket by the washer. It was mostly my grandmother's clothes, her shirts, pants, dresses, and all of that. And about halfway into my loading the washer, Pete tells me that he will do the rest and then tells me to move. Obviously, I did. I didn't want to do the laundry, and I was only doing it for her because she wanted me to. As he is filling the washer, he stops and looks at me, then lets out this evil little chuckle and says, "Hey, watch this." He then proceeds to grab the bottle of bleach and pour half of it into the washer, shuts the lid, and walks out of the laundry room. The only thing I remembered about that moment was that I was shocked and appalled at what he did, but I was also 10, so I didn't know what I should do, so I just walked out of the room and let it be. Obviously, that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, when my aunt went to change out the laundry, she pulled the clothes out of the washer, and the night went to hell. My grandmother was crying, and my aunt was screaming, asking who had done that. At first, I was going to let it go, but seeing my grandma cry broke my 10-year-old heart, so I told her. I told her that it was Pete, that we went to do the laundry, and after we had put all the clothes in, he poured the bleach into the washer. Pete tried to deny it at first, but then yelled about it being an accident, that he thought it was the detergent, that he just grabbed the wrong bottle, and he tried everything he could to get out of it, but they weren't having it. I got in trouble for not telling anyone when it happened, but Pete seriously got the bad end of the stick. A couple of days had passed, and Pete was basically grounded to his room. I was allowed to roam the house, but not supposed to play Nintendo or anything. It was that following Saturday, because my aunt and uncle took my grandma out to get new clothes to replace what Pete had ruined. They left me and Pete, who was confined to his room, under the watch of my 15-year-old cousin Shannon, the one that wanted nothing to do with us. Shannon's babysitting skills were lacking, to say the least, mostly because she was always in her room and on her phone, doing whatever it was that she did. That day, just being the three of us, I asked her if I could go swimming in the lake, and to my surprise she said yes. This was surprising to me, because I was not supposed to swim in the lake without supervision, but I was about to because she said that I could. And like I said, I was a bit of a troublemaker too. So I got my swim trunks on and I ran out back onto the dock and hopped in. I was enjoying myself while everyone was gone. But then out of nowhere, Pete walked out the back door and just stood on the dock staring at me. He tells me that I'm not supposed to be swimming in the lake without an adult around and that something could happen to me. I told him to buzz off and that I was going to enjoy myself while I could swim alone, and that he should go back to his room before he gets in trouble again. He walks away, and within a few minutes, he walks back out with his swim trunks on. He walks out onto the dock and jumps into the water near me. I was annoyed that he wasn't going to leave me alone. But in the end, it was what it was, and I just went back to enjoying the water. After about a minute or two, he calls me over to where he was standing in the water, and I swim over to him. In a hushed tone, he asked me why I told my aunt that he put the bleach in the washer. I told him that it wasn't right, and that I told her because he had hurt our grandma. He huffed at me, and he told me that I shouldn't have told on him, and that it was my fault that he was grounded for the rest of the summer. I told him that it was his own fault and that he shouldn't do things that he does to get in trouble. Unfortunately, that's one of the last things that I remember about this encounter, because within a moment's time, Pete had his hands around my neck and my head underwater. I remember splashing, and I remember trying to yell, and I remember trying to scratch at him or hit him or do anything that would get him to loosen his grip, but none of it worked. Obviously, I didn't die. I'm here to type this story out, but I know that I came close. The next thing I remember is lying on the dock with my cousin Shannon standing over me, alongside some random guy that I'm assuming was at the lake and saw what happened. And I remember that someone else was basically holding Pete down onto the ground. The next thing that's in my hazy memory of events was being in an ambulance and being checked for. I'm assuming breathing, having the oxygen mask on me, and being talked to by a paramedic. The rest of this story, unfortunately, is what I was told by my cousin Shannon. She said that she was in her room and had actually gone to get Pete to tell him to go outside and swim with me because she was actually going to join us and she didn't want him in the house alone. She said that she went into his room and he wasn't there, and when she had gone to the kitchen where the back door was, she saw him jumping into the lake. She went back to get her swimsuit on, and when she had gotten out back, She actually caught the tail end of Pete holding me under the water. She said that as she ran outside, I had actually stopped flailing, so I was out. She told me that the other guy was a good Samaritan that had actually seen Pete choking me, and that he had run over to help get me out of the water, and that the person holding Pete down was the guy's son. The guy was apparently a nurse and had managed to get me breathing again, but he said that they needed to call the ambulance because I could have brain damage. I was apparently out for a little bit before I faded back into consciousness. Of course, this was probably the worst summer of my life. My own cousin, and at that time best friend, tried to murder me because I snitched on him. I got to spend a day in the hospital and got to experience nearly drowning. If you're curious, my cousin Pete is in prison, but not for this, but for other charges: grand larceny, attempted murder, and assault of a police officer with intent to do bodily harm. Obviously, he never changed, and that summer was the last time that he and I ever spoke. He was in and out of juvie as a teenager, and then moved up to much worse crimes, obviously. So while that summer was full of experiences, it's one that left me a bit mentally scarred. I'm now terrified of water, and really, I hope that someday I can just forget it and go swimming again. Though, that's not likely to happen anytime soon. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough to not feel too isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter, and it was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I have never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I just ignored it and I went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired, and even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and then call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and I picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright that I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9 or something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and I called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and I ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time that I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one that I was in, and a spare in a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and then into the bathroom. And thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and then hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and then stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom because they charged back into my room and then turned the light on. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the axis, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. And after a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs, and I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain that I could climb down without him hearing. And after some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided that it was safe enough to climb down and then call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was that the intruder had flipped my bed over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise that I heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and then called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks that I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the box and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. And as far as I could tell though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom, and they found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said that people often use to smoke meth. So they think that he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me that I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep, and I moved the shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple of hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and then motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and then I added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. But nothing else happened at that house though, and I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed and going to my closet and then climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting into the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. Way back when I was a kid, my father, my brother, and I would spend most of our summers off of school out in a certain lake near Ontario, Canada. I'm not going to name the specific lake because I don't want to be more detailed than Ontario. But I'm sure you internet sleuths out there could figure it out with enough time and detail. Anyways, we lived pretty close to the said lake, and my dad was all about nature, so the three of us would spend hours of each day out just on the lake, either on the shore or in our small rowboat fishing. We had a lot of luck out there, and we always caught something. But we were strictly catch and release though. We never kept or ate any of the fish that we caught. After my dad passed away when I was about 15, my brother and I wanted to keep the traditions alive, and we wanted to keep going out to the lake to go fishing in his honor. I know that's a weird way to honor someone, but it was the closest we ever were to our dad, and it was some of the best memories that we'd ever created. Basically, it was kind of like being there with him without him being there. It was a bit emotional, but it was nice. Now, with the backstory of my dad and why we were there out of the way, I think I should kind of explain how this lake was situated. It's a fairly small lake situated in a number of larger lakes, in that it's part of a grouping of lakes and is kind of on its own. It's got a few areas that cove off, and there's actually one section that almost looks like an underwater cave, like it goes under the land that's been lifted a little bit over time. Because of this, it's actually a really good fishing spot for the bottom dweller type fish, namely catfish and bass. We typically would take our small boat onto the lake and then fish in the center, but sometimes we would fish off the edge. Just near where the cave-like area is, there are a lot of trees, and it leads into a decent-sized forest area. Now, this all seems like it's completely boring and irrelevant to the whole thing, but I think it's actually critical to know that this lake is by wilderness in our areas that aren't commonly traversed by people. This story is actually the last time that my brother and I ever went to that lake, mostly because of what happened. This happened around the time that I was 17, so 2 years after my dad passed, in our 3rd year of going together. Everything went as normal. We got out to the lake early in the morning, and we got our small boat in the water, and we were ready to catch some fish. The lake was a bit cooler that morning. It had rained some overnight, but it was also summer, so it was muggy and foggy, and I didn't expect to catch anything, to be honest. But after about half an hour, we had actually had a few hits and caught some smaller fish. About 2 hours into the morning, so somewhere around 7:30 or so, we were floating in the lake and came up near where the cave area was. When I say near, I just mean in the general vicinity, nowhere actually near the cave itself, but we could just see it. I'm sitting there with my pole in the water, and my brother is dozing off behind me. And out of nowhere, we start to hear this weird gurgling noise. We both kind of perk up and look around, just thinking, what the hell is that? When it slows to a stop. By this point, we are both invested, searching around us for bubbles, and then we hear it again. After doing this back and forth for a couple of times, we decided that we should probably head away from whatever it was that was making that sound, mostly because it sounded strange, kind of creepy. Really, it was just weird. We started rowing away from the cave area and back to the other side of the lake when we saw something. It was crawling out of the cave area, and when I say crawl, I mean crawl. This thing was acting like a person would if they were super tall and lanky and living underwater. It grabbed onto the mud at the top of the cave-like area, and it pulled itself up onto the shore. And then it started crawling towards the woods. The best way I could describe it, take the image of a 7-foot-tall person, slim down any and all fat or muscle so that the skin and the bone are touching directly, paint it mostly dark brown to black, then remove all hair. I have no idea what the hell it was, but it was terrifying. Both myself and my brother saw this thing pull itself out of the water and up onto the shore, then watched it as it crawled out into the woods. As soon as it was out of sight, we got our back ends out of the lake and in the car, and we talked over what it was we should do about this thing. But really, neither of us had any idea. He said we should call the police. I told him that we would sound like we were crazy trying to describe a monster crawling from the lake, and he agreed. My thoughts were that we should just leave and never come back to this lake ever. Like at all, because that thing scared the living hell out of me. It was unfortunate, but that was the last time we went to that lake, and we didn't go back the next year. My brother and I still go fishing. We just do so at Lake Ontario now, and we have yet to see any sort of creature crawling out of the water. But I suppose that there's always that possibility. And here's the riddle for this video.